if you can trust Jesus with your eternity, that he has saved you, redeemed you by what he's done on the cross, can you not also trust him with this life, with every aspect of this life, from your romantic relationship to your career, to your physical health, to your mental health, to your finances, to every part that composes your life? He's not God only of your eternity. He's the God of your life now. And so don't fret. Don't be overwhelmed. Just continue to walk in submission to him, knowing that he can take care of you.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Rooted, where we are rooted in truth, growing in freedom, and prospering in life. We're your hosts, Josie and Symone, and we are so excited to have a very special guest with us here today, John Nau from Solid Rock Church back in Fulda. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Yeah, thanks, ladies. I'm super excited to be here and enjoyed listening to your podcast, and find it to be a great honor to be able to sit here and just chat with you for a little while.
Yeah, we're so excited to just chat with you too, John. And we would just like to start out by asking you, could you explain a little bit about your growing up and your childhood and what that kind of looked like?
So I grew up in big city of Worthington, Minnesota. It's always kind of been home for me, and grew up there and enjoyed the small town feel. Yet, I don't know, like growing up there, it didn't feel very small. I guess I didn't realize it was small until I went to college in a bigger city.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I like to think back to is like some of the first like core memories that I have. And it always sticks out to me. I think now that I look back, I feel like I was kind of a weird kid. But like after school type thing, like I'd always go play in the creek, like with my buddy Scott. We'd catch crawdads and go out to marshes and catch toads and stuff like that. And that was just what we did for fun. But yeah, I grew up in Worthington, and then I graduated back in 2003. Pretty sure that was way before you guys were born.
I was born in 2003. So right when I was born. And 2 years later, I was there.
Oh, we're right in that wheelhouse then. So yeah, I grew up there. My dad worked construction. My mom worked various jobs, and big influences in my life. And then I went to college up in Minneapolis at North Central University before moving back to Worthington. And so that's kind of my roots and my home base. And every time I go back there, I can, just remember all the different stories and things that kind of help shape me to who I am. And so that's a little bit of the beginning.
Well, great. Yeah. So a little bit of context for our audience. John is the pastor at the home church that Symone and I grew up at. And we've just appreciated all the leadership that you've shown at that church. So I would love to know, when you were a kid, did you always dream about being a pastor, or is that something that just came later in life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually get that one pretty often, in the sense of where people are like, when did you know you wanted to be a pastor? And honestly, no, that's not what I wanted to do at all. Actually, I remember in fourth grade, I made a wager with some classmates. And I said, I guarantee you, by the time I'm 40, I'm going to walk on the moon, because I wanted to be an astronaut. So, yeah, there was like 5 classmates. I think that I owe them all each $10. I think that's what the wager was.
That's so funny. Wow.
But that kind of fell through once I realized, I'm not very into science as far as like a high level of understanding things. And so that kind of went out the window. And so I transitioned to my longing, and I wanted to actually become a missionary. And growing up, I heard missionaries, so many times, because I wanted to tell people about Jesus. I knew him at a young age, and I knew he loved me, and I wanted people to hear that. And so I wanted to be a missionary to North Korea for a lot of my junior high and high school years. Never once imagined being a pastor. Never crossed my mind. Never anything I wanted to do. It just kind of came about. So yeah, so it was either the moon or North Korea, and here I am in Fulda.
That's crazy. That's amazing what God can do. Do you feel like your family was a huge influence on your faith and like growing up in a Christian home?
Yeah, definitely. I was surrounded by, a great family to point me to Christ, and great community around. But I look back to just the the consistency. Like you hear lots of times that what is optional for a parent becomes unimportant to the child. For me, it was we were always at church, and it wasn't there in a way of like we have to go, we're obligated to go, but there's a desire to go. This is good for you. So they helped form that within me. There's a lot of rough moments, right? As probably most people have, but even in those rough moments, like my family never questioned following Christ, and if anything else, it drew them closer. And so I just saw that consistency, and I honestly I couldn't imagine doing anything else or not being a part of following Christ. And one thing that always stuck out to me is growing up, my family didn't have a lot of money, but I always remember my dad giving like every Sunday. And that really spoke to me because he didn't do it for show. He didn't make sure everybody saw. It was none of that. He just did it because he trusted God and knew that the Lord would take care of us. And so I think that was formulative, because I'm like, wow, if I see as a young kid some of these struggles, yep, my dad's willing to trust God, in this, then I can trust him. I want to follow him. So cool things like that really just kind of spoke to me as a kid and instilled that foundation.
Yeah, wow, that's huge. And kind of touching on the hardships that you kind of mentioned, I know that you've mentioned in church that you experienced a sickness as a child. Could you kind of elaborate that to our audience a little bit?
Yeah, this is a fun one. So I remember in 6th grade, I was really excited because we had cutting edge technology at West Elementary in Worthington. And we had just introduced video announcements.
Oh, wow.
Where, every week on Friday, there was 3 or 4 6th graders that were recorded doing announcements, and the whole school saw. I remember looking forward to doing that. I was up in October or something. And so it was a couple weeks before that, and I just got an earache. Like kids get earaches. You've probably both had earaches. And sometimes you go to the doctor for them, and other times oh, it's just an earache. It'll go away in a couple of days. Well, I had it for a couple of days, and then I woke up one morning and the whole side of my face was paralyzed. And so initially it's well, did you just sleep on it wrong? It just looks weird. When I say paralyzed, I mean my mouth was completely past center on my face. I couldn't close my eye.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
I couldn't open one nostril. And one of the first things I checked was I couldn't wiggle my ear, because as a kid, you're like, ears. And so I went to school and didn't think much of it, and we made an appointment with a doctor later that day because it hadn't changed. And they said, well, we think you might have Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy is a condition that, I had all the symptoms for, and then it just resolves itself in a week or so. So I remember they said, but there's a few things you have to do. So I had to tape my eyes shut at night because I couldn't close it. And they're like, if you can't close it, it could dry out and you could lose your eye.
Oh my goodness.
And so as a 6th grade kid, I don't want to
That's
pass.
so scary.
Oh, wow.
And so, but I remember it really wasn't a big deal to me because the doctor said in a couple of weeks, I'll be fine. And a couple of weeks came and it was up for me to do video announcements. And so we went and recorded it. I knew I sounded a little bit different because since my mouth wasn't how it was supposed to be, I was slurring more. But it wasn't until we did video announcements and I saw myself up on the screen that it kind of that insecurity and that fear hit me. Because for the first time, I really saw myself how other people saw me. And if I saw a person like that and I didn't know what was going on, I'd be like, what is wrong with them? Right? It was that obvious. And so that's when it really, I think that's where a root of insecurity kind of dug into me in 6th grade, because suddenly I went from this happy, fun-loving, enjoy life to self-conscious and worried and fearful of it always being like this. I'm giving you a long version.
No,
so
this
feel
is
free to
great.
click.
No,
Yeah.
this is great. Keep going. Yeah.
So then it's been a couple of weeks and nothing ever cleared up. And so then the doctors put me on steroids to try and help. They still didn't know what was going on. And I remember being on steroids in 6th grade and combing my hair and like the comb would be full of hair. And I was like, what is happening? And I remember being angry. Like I was on roid raging as a sixth grader. So steroids didn't work. And so then I tried acupuncture, which really freaked me out when I thought about these needles being put in over my face and like my arm and stuff. They did like electric shock therapy on my face. So there was these two metal prongs that they would stick in water and they would pinch nerve pressure points on my face and shock me. And I'm like, what?
That's so scary.
And I'm in sixth grade wearing like my No Fear shirt. That was a big brand back then, and my Zubaz or whatever. And I'm just freaked out and
Oh, I love that.
insecure and all this. And it was tough. And then you had the other side, that like name calling and stuff like that, like on the bus, and kids are not always completely understanding, right? They notice something different and jump on it, and nothing really changed through all those treatments. And so pretty sure about a year went by, and they wanted to try a surgery because what they think happened was just a normal ear infection went into my facial nerve overnight and like killed it. Like just a freak thing.
Wow.
And so they scheduled me for surgery where they basically cut off my ear and went into my face, drilled out my mastoid and a part of a bone so my nerve could swell. And they thought that would help heal it. So
wait, so did they have to like
seventh grade?
put your ear back on?
So they cut the whole back of it off and like folded it forward, folded it and drilled. And I had like a big like donut on the side of my face while it healed. And it helped my face. Like I could close my eye at night, my smile, like I got like half my smile back. I could open my nostril, but it still wasn't a full correction. So then it's like, okay, we're at an end of what we can do medically. And I think that with anybody who goes through any sort of health journey, especially if you're a follower of Christ, you're kind of like, okay, God, now what? Why as a kid is this happening to me? 1, 2, God, I believe you can heal me, but why hasn't it happened? And then wrestling through things with insecurity and just kind of that whole mess. And I think it kind of gets you to a point where, and I don't want to equate the two things, with like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Like that's where I kind of had to get. Like I'm not equating being thrown into a furnace with this, right? But it was like, God, I know that you can heal me, and I know that that's your heart, and I don't fully understand all of this, but even if you don't, like I'll be all right. Like you'll take care of me. Things will work out. I would just really appreciate this. Someday wake up and be like, wow, it's gone. Because like even things that may sound dumb, like I just joined band that year for the first time. And I was a year behind all my friends, and I wanted to play trumpet. And so I started playing trumpet for 3 or 4 weeks. And then this happened, and I had to quit band because my mouth couldn't form the right position anymore.
Wow.
So it was messy for a while internally.
Yeah. How did you get over kind of that insecurity? Because as a sixth grader, having people call you names and whatnot, that's tough.
I would like to say that just by trusting the Lord, and this, but it was a much longer process than I care to admit. Like I even remember taking my senior pictures and getting those and like looking at them and be like, I wonder what it'd be like if I had a full smile type of thing. And so I don't know if, when it comes to insecurity especially, I think that is such a sensitive thing because we obviously don't like to talk about what we're insecure about because we're insecure about it, right? We don't want to point attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, it was overcoming that insecurity associated with that really came down to the fact that the Lord knew that I was going to be here and that I was going to be dealing with this. And if he knew that I was going to be dealing with this and the struggles and the hurt, then he's already provided an answer for it, even if that answer isn't what I hoped it would be. So if that answer for this that I hope it would be a complete healing and restoration, maybe his answer for it is something that helps me to see past other people's, physical issues perhaps, or something like that. And And so that's just where I had to land. Like, God knew I'd be here. He's provided the answer already. I just have to rely on that. And when the thoughts come, or that you're reminded of the names that you've been called or whatever, you can't empower them by dwelling on them. And that's where
Yeah,
I just had to.
that's great. And do you have anything to say to those who are dealing with a sickness or who keep praying for healing and know that there's a God who heals, but they're not being healed? What do you have to say to those people?
Yeah, I have no doubts that God's still able and still willing. I'm not a cessationist in the sense of where some people believe that those miraculous things ended with the word. It just doesn't make sense to me that God's character would change. And so as I've walked through this, I've never gotten to the point that I've questioned the goodness of God, but instead it's helped me to trust it more. So it's not a life or death type of sickness, but it's one that I'm reminded of every day, or I could be reminded of every day. So I would say if someone's really struggling with that, like, don't let it change your vantage point of the character of God. I've prayed for people and I've seen them healed, like right away. I've prayed for people and they've gotten better over time. I've prayed for people and they've died, right? And I think the enemy's ultimate goal in our life is despair. And so if we give into despair over an unanswered prayer in our point of view, or give into despair because we're discouraged that this person still passed away or that I'm still feeling sick, then I think that that's where his victory really lies. So if someone is still sick, keep believing. Like, what else are you going to do? Quit?
Yeah.
Give up? Question
Yeah.
of God. And that's probably the most important thing I would just say is I don't have all the answers to why sometimes and why not others. But don't quit. I mean, your only option is to either disbelieve God's goodness or keep hanging on to his willingness. And knowing that I don't have to convince God of anything, but I'm just going to stand and surrender to where I'm at already with him.
Yeah, and I love that so much, and I think that also just plays true to my life and probably a lot of others where we can get in this cycle of questioning why God, why God, why God,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have to know everything, right? Like Satan wants us to question his every move and make that affect our doubt and our belief, and just focusing on our God, like his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that he's the God of the universe who has orchestrated everything and he's before all things. And just remembering, like, I'm not going to have all the answers, but if I did, I would be God, right?
Yeah.
And so we can often question that, but yeah, just focusing on who he is, who his character is, and knowing that his character will never change.
Right. That was really well put. You have to get to a point where you're ready to receive that, though, right? Like if you are in the middle of the hurt, like I was when I was in the middle of it, and if somebody would share those things, it doesn't mean that it's not true. It means that I'm not healed enough emotionally to receive that. And so it's that balance of sharing that truth with people, but also sharing in that crud with them too. So that when
Yes.
they're ready to receive that, it's like, okay, here's what you need to be reminded of in the middle of this hurt.
So good.
Wow, yeah, I love that. I honestly just love all the things that you talk about at church, and what's really cool about you and your church experience is that the church that you're currently leading is actually a church plant, and there's a lot of challenges but also joys that come with starting a new church and creating a church plant. Could you kind of share your experience about that and kind of what you've learned through the process of starting up a new church?
Yeah, for sure. Like it wasn't my plan to ever pastor. Same thing. It was never on my radar to plant a church. In fact, the church that I was previously at, Solid Rock in Worthington, when I went on staff, Pastor Scott asked if I ever would want to plant a church. And I kind of looked at him and, with this confused look, I'm like, why would I do that? Like, we have a church, there's churches around. Why would I ever want to plant a church? And so for me, it took a very direct leading from the Lord. I mean, this was the clearest I have ever heard God speak to my life in anything. And so just to preface the beginning of this, I moved to Fulda from Worthington, where I worked, because my soon-to-be wife is a teacher in Slayton. And Fulda was the halfway point. So it's like, if you're going to keep teaching and I'm going to keep being youth pastoring in Worthington, then let's move halfway. And so I commuted from Fulda, a town of 1,300, to the metropolis of Worthington of 13,000 every day. And one morning I was driving to Worthington. And the best way I could put it is that I just had this almost, it wasn't an out of body, but I just had this clear sense that God wanted to speak to me. I don't know how to describe it other than my heart was almost like in a state of like reverence before God. Like I'm just driving, listening to like, Google Dolls or something awesome like that. And I'm like, I got to shut them off and I need to listen. And so I shut off the radio, and I remember I would describe it as this thought in my heart. It wasn't anything in my head. It wasn't like a normal thought. It was something that was almost outside of me, but I knew it was the Lord. And it was simply this question: what if I want you to plant a church in Fulda? And I immediately knew it was the Lord, because I knew it wasn't me. It wasn't something I ever wanted to do. I knew it wouldn't be the enemy. Like that doesn't make sense, right? And it was never anything that I heard. And so I just had a quick ran through all these filters, of where's this coming from? It's like I knew it was God, and I just said, okay, I don't know how, but let's do it. And so that kind of began the process. And I had no idea how to do it. Like I've obviously never planted a church before or anything like that. But I just started praying about it. And then I talked with Pastor Scott about it too. And actually that brought some confirmation, because God had been stirring that in his heart as well. What I did then is just started being around like-minded people, like in our community. And as we went down the journey, I soon had to realize, one, that it was God's church, not mine. Like I'm not planting a church for me. It's all his anyway. He will build the church, he says. And so we just started game planning and doing community outreaches and praying and spreading the word and trusting God and building resources and teams and all this. And we launched in 2018 in a high school gym where we'd set up and tear down every week. And we've been doing that now for 6 years. And it's just been incredible, because we have people from all sorts of church backgrounds. And then we have just a ton of people who are new to their faith in Christ. And I think that what I've really learned in planting this church is you have to keep what's important to God important to us. So instead of trying to impress or build or make sure we have all these things that people want or expect, like what is it that God wants and expects? Because if I'm catering things to even to reach people, then I'm not following the Spirit of God. I'm following the pressures of people. And I think that that's just been one thing that's really stuck out to me. That's why at this point, I could never imagine leaving this church to go and pastor another existing church. Like that seems like so difficult. I would rather plant a church that seems so much easier than having to walk in and be like, well, here's what's important to us. And maybe the Lord needs to work on my heart with that. But I just don't got time to try and cater to people's expectations when I think the Lord is calling his people to simply just follow him. Does that make sense? Or does that sound prideful?
No, that totally makes sense. And I love what you said about what you're being called to and how sometimes that almost can feel like you're unqualified or you're scared or like, oh, I never see myself in that situation. Do you feel like you struggled with the fact of, I never saw myself as being a pastor and I don't feel qualified to do this, but I'm called to this? Like, what were some of those thoughts going through your mind?
Yeah, that's a good thing that you pulled out there. I think that those sort of situations confirm that it's God to me. Right. The Lord absolutely uses us in our strengths and what we're prepared for. And it can even lead us, in preparation of this is what's next. But when something's kind of out of the blue, you have to trust God in it. I have no idea how to pastor, no idea how to plant a church. When I took over the youth ministry, I never once took any college classes in youth ministry. When I took over leading worship, I never once had any sort of training with, like, it's just like, okay, God, like if this is
Yeah.
next, like I have to depend on you. And that's where Paul says, in my weakness, he is strong. And I think we miss God more in our strengths than we do in our weaknesses, because in our strengths, too often we put our confidence in us.
Mhm.
Our weakness, it's like, I have to put my confidence in God.
I think that's such a good point about being able to just step out in faith. And it reminds me of, I was talking with someone the other day and they were just mentioning the story of Peter walking on water. And they brought up an interesting point that I never thought about, because you always think, oh, like, Peter walked on water and Jesus was there, but he didn't know what would happen when he'd step out of the boat. He knew
Yeah.
Jesus and he knew Jesus' character and he knew that Jesus was calling him to him. And he had to step out of the boat in faith without knowing what was going to happen. And it was such a good reminder for me of, sometimes you do have to take that first step and step out in faith, and you don't know what the result is, but you know who's calling you and who he's calling you to. And so I think that's just such a great reminder for all of us that, you might not know the end goal, but you ultimately know who's behind it, and that's Jesus. So sometimes you do have to just step
Yeah.
out in faith.
How do you feel like people can get to that spot where they're comfortable not knowing what's going to happen or the result? Basically, how can people obey God without having a backup plan? Maybe is the way I'd phrase it.
I think, like you said, with it's harder to trust God when in your strength than in your weakness. And I think that in my life, at least, the times where I've gotten to the lowest, where I don't have any options and I don't know what's next, it's like, okay, God, you're all I have. I can't come up with my own idea on my own. You have to figure it out. And I think there is so much truth in, when we are weak, then he is strong. And as much as that's hard sometimes it is when you're at the lowest that you really can trust him. And so that's been a conviction for me specifically of, okay, when I do feel strong and when I feel like things are going well, how can I still trust him in that? And how can I still listen for his calling in that? Because sometimes it's easy to forget during those times. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say also getting to that point of actually wanting his plan for your life. Like, if you're still kind of living for yourself and thinking, okay, well, I'm not capable, I can't do this, then you're not going to listen to his voice that's calling you to do something that you can't do. And kind of like Peter, like once he was out on the water, well, he had to keep his eyes locked on Jesus because this was not by his own doing. And as soon as he like looked at the water, looked at the chaos around him, that's when he started to sink. And so keeping your eyes locked on Jesus and knowing, I can't do this without you, Lord, and I want to live only for you, which is why I'm going to listen to your voice and I'm actually going to do it and I'm going to lock my eyes on you in the process.
Yeah, that's such a good reminder and so important that that's that consistent. All right, Lord, I've started this following you. I'm going to continue because you're trustworthy in all these things.
I just want to ask you a little bit more about your pastoring and some of your messages. And is there a specific topic or story or something that you're just the most passionate about speaking on?
Oof, that's a good one. I would say something that I haven't really presented yet, but often you can hear, or maybe you have heard, that God seems so different in the Old Testament versus the New Testament, right? Different characteristics, type of thing. And I think that it's just, we see what happens when the sacrifice of Jesus fulfills the call to justice. So one thing that really intrigues me is how everything in the Old Testament ultimately points to Jesus, whether it's a law, whether it's a feast, whether it's a sacrifice, and how it all is fulfilled in Jesus. That's why Jesus said, I didn't come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. I think it's in an even deeper aspect than just, oh, we don't have to do these things now because, Jesus died on the cross. But what I think what I'm passionate about is Jesus knew how to relate to anybody. He knew how to relate to the foreign woman, right, who was full of immorality. he related to her in a way that she could see God. He knew how to speak to the religious leaders in a way that they, like Nicodemus, like, wow, what are you sharing? He knew how to speak to a group, how he knew how to speak to an individual. And I guess one thing that's really important to me is that the word of God, I'm called to preach that. Like that's what he's anointed me to do. So I need to be mindful of what is it going to take to reach the people who I'm speaking to. That I can't just sit in my wheelhouse of, well, this is how I like to speak and how I like to prepare, but rather, what is it that the listener will be able to receive openly? And this doesn't mean watering things down. What it means to me is I have to put in the work and obviously trusting the Lord, and it's all a work of the Holy Spirit. But I need to be sensitive enough to God and to his leading in the preparation that whether I'm speaking to a group of seventh graders or if I'm speaking to like the nursing home and everything in between, that I can relay the truth of God's word in a way that they can grasp. And I've never, ever took like a hermeneutics or a homiletics class. I guess I'm kind of showing my cards here. What those are the big classes that pastors take to help understand the meaning of the word and how to preach the word. I never took either of them. And so I don't say that as a ignorance, badge of honor, but I say it in a way of, God, I'm trusting you to equip me the way that you want me to share these things. And so what's really sparked my interest recently is the Old Testament complete fulfillment in Christ. And what I'm really passionate about is putting in the work and the forethought to speak to the level of the people that I'm going to be speaking to.
That's great advice.
I love the part that you talked about with everything in the Old Testament pointing to Jesus, and it reminds me of the Jesus Storybook Bible. Our family would read that all the time, and it was just
I
such a
loved that.
cool thing as a kid to see these stories like the Tower of Babel, Joseph and the colorful coat, like all of those stories, how they slowly pointed to Jesus and to his character. And I love that book. I would still read that book even as an adult now. So I love that point of everything pointing to Jesus.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the hallmarks of our church in particular, because we have so many people, like I mentioned before, from all these different backgrounds, but they're just hungry for Jesus and for God to do what he wants in our community. Willing to say, hey, I may see this theological issue different than you, but we're going to work together for the kingdom of God. And I think that the fact that we're a very young church in terms of demographics help with that people are just hungry to see God move in a fresh way in our communities, even if the community is only 1,300 people. And so I think that almost in a double meaning of what you're saying, Josie, how you love how everything points to Jesus. Like, I think that just needs to continue to be a hallmark of our church. Like, and when I speak, like, I'm in a series right now on relationships. In every sermon, whether I'm talking about friendship, dating, marriage, parenting, my goal in every one of those is to somehow have a point to the gospel and not just, here's 5 things to have a healthy, successful marriage. And that's my role. And that's what the church should be doing.
I know another hallmark of the Solid Rock Church, you talk about our ceiling and their floor. What does that mean for the church?
Yeah, we have 4 core values. These 4 core values, actually, the Lord laid upon my heart when I was at something called Church Planting Boot Camp.
Oh, wow.
Which was like boot camp. We got serious. It was like a 3-day event where they just kind of pour in and equip us and challenge us and resource us. And one of the 4 values that was kind of laid upon my heart, and I'm sure it's not original to me. I'm sure I heard it somewhere along the line. But it's just this idea for the next generation that our ceiling, like where we leave off in life, in knowledge and understanding, we want that to be their floor. Now, granted, every person has to make that decision to follow Christ, right? Like they can't leave off spiritually in a sense start where we left off. But what we can do is we can teach them. We can disciple them, say, here is what I learned from my mistakes. Don't make the same ones. here is what took me 30 years to learn in our marriage. You don't need to learn all that, the hard way. Like, why are we, sorry, I'm getting kind of loud.
No, you're good.
Why are we
We love it.
so like clammed up and like not being willing to share both the good and the bad with one another for their benefit? Like,
So true.
why do I not love them enough to say, hey, when I was 18, I really fell into this. Here's what that cost me. Avoid that, right? Here's what we fell into early in our marriage, and teaching the next generation, right? Like maybe your kids when they're dating, or another young couple in the church, just wanting to pour into them. You don't have to learn the hard way. If you have somebody who learned the hard way, teach you how to avoid the hard way and still learn the same lesson. And so I'm very visually oriented, and I just kind of picture like using all my resources and abilities to build something up and then hand the baton off to the next generation. Say, here you go. We set you up the best we could. Now run the race God's marked for you.
That's so good.
So good.
And
I love
I
that.
think that you do an excellent job of that, of investing in the next generation, because you're always, I mean, obviously in the church, but you're also out at camp every summer, and you're always specifically talking to junior hires, and kind of going to that topic of dating that you mentioned and having good marriages and whatnot. What are some of the things that you tell those junior hires that really kind of instill in them, what does dating look like? What is a marriage supposed to be? Because I think you have some great thoughts on that.
Well, I feel like we better put it on the record what happened at camp a couple of years ago, or we're doing a disservice to your entire listening community. So I like to share stories to kind of build the bridge and intrigue, especially with younger people, right? I want to captivate them in a way that their hearts open up to listen to what I think God might want to share through me. So we were talking about dating one morning chapel out at camp, which I love going out there. I've been now invited out, I think, for 5 years or something. And like, do you know your parents invited me out to speak before they ever heard me speak?
Really? Did they really?
Yeah. And I'm like,
That's putting a lot
Yeah.
of trust in
Wow.
God and in you.
Yeah. I'm like, you're either really desperate or, man, you just trust me, even though, we haven't worked together in that capacity. So I'm talking about dating out there, right? And I'm building up this story of, if you're jumping into relationships or you're trying to impress, it's going to cost you. And in kindergarten, I was at the junior high in Worthington at my older brother's conference, and I'm running up and down the bleachers trying to impress a girl that I had a crush on in kindergarten. I'm just building this story up like she is the love of my life. And what happened was I tripped on the bleachers and I fell and I bit off my tongue. Like, it was hanging on by a little.
Oh,
That's awful.
So much so, it was disgusting. It was like a blood geyser. My dad sees me. Would take me to the ER. 75 stitches. They sew it back on. Yep, that's the story. But at camp, I am sharing this story about this girl, and I say her name out loud, and your mother, Kirsten Harms, goes, "Her son is here." And this girl who I'm telling this whole story about, her son is sitting as a keeper that week of camp, and all the kids look at him, and he turns bright red. And to this day, I still kind of feel sorry for him because he did not ask for that attention.
Oh my goodness.
I remember that. That was so funny.
That's one of the few times it's like, I don't even know what to do or say right now. I'm just so like shocked that this happened.
Oh, that's
Wow.
hilarious.
That's a fun story. So don't do that. Don't run up and down the stairs trying to impress a girl. So what should you do instead?
When I look back, especially to my high school years, I was always trying to capture the attention of somebody who I may have had a crush on, but who I knew wasn't interested in me. And I kind of felt like I wanted to earn that interest. And I think especially with guys, there's something within them that can be more about the adventure and the catching than the actual relationship. But I think that's important to understand, because I think for young men, you need to realize, are you really looking for a relationship, or are you looking to conquer something, if that makes sense? And for ladies, What this means is guarding your heart matters because he may not be interested in a relationship. He may just be interested in see if he could get a relationship if he wanted.
Mm.
And I think that doesn't really land until you're later in high school because you have to get to a mature level of thinking to understand I'm trying to date this person just so I could say I could date that person, you know?
Right.
Um,
Or just to say, like, I have a girlfriend, or like finding in fulfillment in another person.
yeah. Because the danger in that, if your confidence and fulfillment is in another person, what happens when they let you down, dump you, break your
Right.
heart, whatever it is? I don't know, like, what it is within us that we feel like as a young teenager, we need to have someone else. It's like we're trying to prove our worth, I think. And I think that's one of the most important things that a teenager can understand. Because if you don't understand your worth in Christ, then you're going to look for being valued in a relationship or valued in your performance or valued in some other way.
It's going to fail, and it's going to constantly be changing too.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most greatest pieces of advice that I heard regarding dating, for example, came from my wife. So there was a girl who was in our youth group, and every Wednesday she had a new boyfriend. And there was one time that she'd been dumped, and she was just sobbing, and she's like, my life is over, and I need to have someone. And Kristen's like, well, why do you need to have someone? And kind of working through, like, that's where I find my value, that's the only way I can feel affirmed. And Kristen said this. She said to this young girl, she said, I don't need John. I want John. And
yeah.
I'm like, that's so good. Like, I don't complete Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
I compliment her. But it's a greater definition of love to me. It's like, she doesn't need me, but she's choosing me. As a young person, you don't need someone else, But I know there's still that desire and that longing that's there. And it's just tough to navigate those feelings of attraction or affirmation versus this is a relationship worth pursuing. Then don't bite off your tongue.
Oh, yes.
Does not impress them.
Wow, that's so good. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that insight. We just really appreciate all of the words of truth you've spoken into us in this past podcast, but even just throughout our whole lives. And is there one piece of truth that you would encourage our listeners to be rooted in?
Yes. The one thing that I would encourage you to be rooted in is this. If you can trust Jesus with your eternity, that he has saved you, redeemed you by what he's done on the cross, can you not also trust him with this life, with every aspect of this life, from your romantic relationship to your career, to your physical health, to your mental health, to your finances, to every part that composes your life? He's not God only of your eternity. He's the God of your life now. And so don't fret. Don't be overwhelmed. Just continue to walk in submission to him, knowing that he can take care of you. If he sees the sparrow, if he dresses the wildflower, he can take care of you too.
That is so good. Thank you so much, John. And thank you just for all of your stories, all of your advice on this podcast, and just the amazing pastor that you've been for us in our hometown. So thank you so much for being on this podcast,
Yeah, thanks, John. You're the best.
Thanks, ladies. Proud of you.